So without further ado, we want to go to our first keynote speaker, and that is Dr. Robert Wachter. Dr. Wachter is a professor and chair of the Department of Medicine, you will see him shortly, at the University of California in San Francisco. In 1996, he coined the term hospitalist and is often considered the father of the hospitalist field. He authored some 300 articles, quite a lot, in the medical literature, as well as the public media, such as the New York Times and the Washington Post and USA Today and Wall Street Journal. I'm sure even if you are not from the US, you've heard of those. He has written also 6 books, including The Digital Doctor, Hope, Hype, and Harm at the Dawn of Medicine's Computer Age, which is actually a New York Times science bestseller. His honors include being selected as most influential physician in the United States by Modern Healthcare magazine in 2015, and he received the Eisenberg Award, the nation's top honor in patient safety, in 2004. He was also elected to the National Academy of Medicine in 2020. In 2020 to 21, his tweets on COVID-19 were viewed by over 250 million times by nearly 200,000 followers. And he served as a trusted source of information on the clinical, public health, and policy issues surrounding the pandemic. Today, he's talking about COVID-19 and the digital transformation of healthcare, accelerating the need for a new professionalism. So we have a chance to examine what professional means now. Welcome, Dr. Wachter.
Thank you so much. Yes, can you hear me?
Great. Yes, we can hear you well.
Slides are up. You can see them okay?
Yes, they can be seen very well.
Some feature on Zoom that ultimately tells you that without having to ask, but they have not developed that yet, so we'll appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to your organization, which is doing really important work. I have been very interested in professionalism really for my entire career, and I had the opportunity to chair the American Board of Internal Medicine and serve on its foundation, and professionalism was a core part of our agenda. So it's exciting to be here. As I looked at your agenda and I look at your participants, you all know much more about professionalism than I do. So my goal in the next 40 minutes or so is to talk about the landscape of healthcare, how it is changing, particularly around digital transformation. And then I will have some comments at the end as to what I think what the transformation will mean for professionalism, some of the new opportunities and challenges. And I think you've got a very full day ahead of you. And so my goal really is to be a table setter and to provoke you to think about the world in a less static way, because I do think that healthcare is on the cusp of some enormous changes that will be exciting, but also quite challenging. So before we start, it's been a very tough 18 months. I'd like to be sure everybody's doing okay and check in. And my way of doing it is the Fauci scale. Here are 5 pictures of Fauci's face during 5 moments. I think numbers 2 through 5 were probably in 2020. Number 1 might be in 2021, just to sort of take everybody's temperature. And I would say for me, I'm now a Fauci 1.7. I think in terms of COVID world, we're doing reasonably well, although we have to temper that by recognizing there's still over 1,000 people a day dying in the United States of COVID. So my fear is that we may be entering kind of a new equilibrium where things are relatively stable. They don't get that much better. They don't get that much worse. And this becomes a little bit of a new normal. So what I want to talk about in the next 40 minutes is a few thoughts on the current state of the pandemic and the problems exposed in our politics and society. Spend a very brief amount of time on that, but if we want to talk about COVID more during the discussion, happy to. I'll spend most of my time talking about digital transformation and why I believe it's been accelerated markedly by COVID, and not just the easy answer, which is telemedicine, but much broader set of activities and enablers that have allowed us to reach what I think is something of a tipping point. There are some other technologies that have not yet hit the tipping point, but I think their path through their hype cycle has been accelerated as well. So even though they have not become transformative, I think they will ultimately, and we're closer to that than we were before. I think importantly, and you'll have to think through the implications for professionalism, we're entering an era where the electronic health record, which was sort of the dominant manifestation of digital transformation for healthcare providers in the last decade, is no longer the only thing. It really becomes kind of a foundational and core thing. And what that means is important to understand. And then, as I said, I'll spend maybe the last 5 or 10 minutes talking about my view of how all of this does and should influence our thinking about professionalism in the future. So let's spend a minute or two on COVID. One of the things about COVID that has been fascinating, and why I've enjoy is always the wrong word to think about the last year, but found the last year and a half truly interesting, is I'm a generalist as a physician. I'm a generalist as a researcher. I've studied ethics and policy and health economics and epi. And to understand COVID, you really needed to look at it through all those lenses. And so both in my tweets and in conferences I've run, the lenses are everything from virology to immunology to political science to sociology to ethics. You have to see all of those. And one of the key things that we've all learned in the United States, at least, and to some extent around the world, is that the political and sociologic culture of a society really does influence the response during a pandemic. And I think we've learned that in a hard way in the US. Let me show you a quote from, this is from March 2020. So this is when the pandemic was first hitting the shores in the United States. It was written by Ed Yong, who is, I think, probably the best writer and chronicler of COVID. He writes for The Atlantic, won the Pulitzer last year. And just think about how prescient it is. The parts in yellow I've added because Ed didn't comment on them because they weren't issues at the time. But I think he kind of predicted where things would go. It said aspects of America's identity may need rethinking after COVID. Many of the country's values have seemed to work against it during the pandemic. Its individualism, exceptionalism, and tendency to equate doing whatever you want with an act of resistance meant that when it came time to save lives and stay indoors, at that time, we weren't talking much about masks or vaccination. Some people flocked to bars and clubs and don't and didn't. Having internalized years of anti-terrorism messaging following 9/11, Americans resolved to not live in fear. But the virus has no interest in their terror, only in their cells. I think it's a really kind of smart, thoughtful examination of the American sociology and political culture. And I think it has influenced our entire response. And something as we think about the role of clinicians and healthcare professionals, educating people and working through some of these dynamics is obviously part of our job, even if that's not how you conceived of your work as a doctor or a nurse or another healthcare professional. All right, one last comment about COVID before I move on to digital. People have been asking me a lot about what the end game will be, and I have come to believe that, like I think most experts in this, that there will not be an end to COVID, as in it goes away and life is back to 2019, but a kind of new normal where there's a certain amount of COVID in our lives, at least for the foreseeable future. What's interesting about the current stage is I think most parts of the country have reached a point where 85 or 90% of people have some level of immunity. Where I live in San Francisco, that's largely because almost everyone's gotten vaccinated. So we have 80% of folks who have been vaccinated. When you take eligible people, excluding the kids for now, they'll become eligible next week. It's 85 to 90%. But a relatively small number of people have been infected because we've been quite careful and have a high vaccination rate. When you go to other parts of the country, like the South, the vaccination rate might only be 30 or 40%, but 60 or 70% of people have been infected, and they have some level of immunity. And so there's kind of an odd equilibrium where even in a place that has not taken COVID as seriously or not enacted or enforced some of the public health rules and has low vaccine rates, you still have relatively high levels of immunity by virtue of most people being infected because Delta is so infectious. The analogy I've been using, it was using the New Yorker in quoting me last week, was the painting the Golden Gate Bridge analogy, where the minute you're done painting the bridge, you have to start all over again. The cycle length is about 5 to 7 years. Here, unfortunately, the cycle length will be shorter than that. So we're reaching a point where 85% is not enough to achieve herd immunity, not enough to make the virus go away, but high and tends to put a fair amount of back pressure on surges. The problem is the minute you reach that level of immunity, if you got it through vaccines, you probably need a booster. Certainly you do if you're at risk. If you got it through infection, your immunity begins waning fairly quickly. And the good evidence that a year to a year and a half later, you're not all that immune. And so we're going to be in this sort of constant equilibrium where we have to constantly go back and re-immunize again, either through a booster or unfortunately for people that don't get vaccinated, they'll get immunized again through another infection. And so this level of stability sort of creates a new normal in which we've got to kind of figure out what is life like when this is it. And that's kind of my new attitude. I was very, very careful over the last year. I'm still quite careful, but I'm no longer hesitating to fly to see family, for example, saying, all right, there is not a zero risk, but the risk is quite low. I'm fully immunized. And if I say I'm not doing it now, I may very well be saying I'm not doing it forever. And that's not something I'm comfortable with. So anyway, that's my view of the pandemic. The only thing that could really, I can't see anything that makes it much better than that, which is sad. The only thing that can make it much worse than that is if there's a new variant that is even worse than Delta. So far, the evidence is that that won't happen, and most virology experts don't believe that it will happen, but anything is possible. Okay, that's all I want to say about COVID. Let's turn to the digital transformation of healthcare and how COVID accelerated it. I had the opportunity to host a podcast called In the Bubble that Andy Slavitt runs. Andy became the White House chief COVID sort of communicator for 4 months in January through April. So Andy asked me to take over the show, which was fun. And I interviewed friend John Halamka, who runs the Mayo Clinic platform, which is Mayo's big digital play. And John said this to me: I joined Mayo on January 1st, 2020, and I was handed the 2030 digital transformation plan. Do you know that in 2020, we finished that plan? COVID accelerated 10 years into 10 months. And I think that's really important now. Your system, if you work in a health system, is not Mayo, nor is mine, in terms of its ambitions and national scope or international scope and resources. But the point that COVID really moved things along is a very important point. Now, we were on our path toward digital transformation. We've been on that path for a decade. The first step in that path was the ubiquitous acquisition and implementation of electronic health records in hospitals and in doctors' offices. I spent a year of my life in 2015 writing a book about how bumpy that transition was. But I think it's important to recognize that the path was beginning by putting in this electronic health record, and then on top of it, doing a whole lot of other stuff with the data and building a lot of new tools. That path was probably going to take 20 years, I imagine. And I don't think COVID shortened it by 10, but it certainly has shortened it and accelerated it. So the things that we all had to think about in terms of the implications of digital transformation, including on professionalism, we better think about them faster because they're coming at us much more quickly than they would have. Probably the most tangible manifestation of that is telemedicine. This is from my own institution. It's quite typical of institutions around the country. Telemedicine has been a technology that's been ready for prime time just as a technology for 5 years, maybe 10, but has been held back by a bunch of regulatory requirements, a bunch of payment rules, and frankly, a change. And that doctors weren't ready to embrace it. Patients weren't ready to embrace it. But COVID forced all of that to move along because nobody wanted to see anybody. And so here at UCSF, you see a gradual increase in televisits from 0 to 1%, ultimately to 2%. And in a month, that went from 2% to 55%. A couple of weeks after that, it was 70%. This is in line with the national experience. It's come down some at UCSF, down to about 30%, nationally down to about 20%, variable by fields. But the point is that telemedicine has clearly hit its tipping point. By the way, I should confess a conflict on this one. I advise a company called Teladoc, which is a very large telemedicine provider. So why did this happen? Mostly fear. Neither patients nor doctors wanted to go out of their houses. But very importantly, payers and regulators sort of got the message that we need to enable telemedicine. And they did that by relaxing some of the regulatory barriers like state-by-state licensure requirements and creating payment parity so that the payment for a televisit and the payment for an in-person visit were the same. And the future of telemedicine will be determined by what happens with these payment and regulatory changes, but I don't think we're going back to 2%, and I don't think that the regulatory barriers will be reenacted. Now that health systems and patients have tasted telemedicine, they are going to want at least that option. And sort of the analogy is Uber. There were a lot of regulatory requirements around taxi cab medallions that got in the way of Uber and Lyft in the beginning. And then eventually, as people got to see the advantages of that kind of transportation, they were able to overcome the regulatory barriers. So that's a fairly typical issue, and I think telemedicine's here to stay. So how interesting, how transformational is telemedicine? My feeling about it is not that interesting or transformational, but potentially paving a path toward a healthcare world that is far more interesting and far more transformational. So what do I mean by that? If telemedicine is simply a visit replacement, if I went to see my doctor here in San Francisco, and rather than driving and parking and paying $20 to park and sitting in the waiting room and reading an old Reader's Digest and then going to see the doctor for 12 minutes, and now I can do that sitting in my living room, that's a decent sized deal, and I like it better as a patient. In fact, the patient satisfaction surveys are generally significantly higher for televisits than in-person visits. Our providers seem to like it fine as long as they can be paid for it. It gives them some more options about when and where they do their visits. I'd say the most transformational thing at a policy level is it opens up non-geographically determined care options. So for the rural patient who didn't have access to see a cardiologist, a psychiatrist, because there's no one in his or her region, or if you think about it, if you were Mayo 25 years ago and you said, there's just not enough patients here in Rochester, Minnesota for us to grow. We want to grow. What did you do? You bought or built buildings in Scottsdale, Arizona, and in Florida. Today, I think if you were Mayo or a large healthcare system that had national aspirations, you'd be thinking much more about your virtual strategy than your bricks and mortar strategy. So if you're a small community hospital who didn't really have any competition because you were the only game in town, now the game changes in the same way it changed for a local bookstore that didn't have any competition until there was Amazon. So I think you're going to start seeing the emergence of national brands, which is going to create a much more competitive landscape, which ultimately should be good for patients, should potentially drive down costs, although nothing ever seems to do that in healthcare, but at least provide options to see different systems, different doctors in new ways. So that's a pretty big deal. And I think telemedicine certainly has some importance, and the fact that it really hit its tipping point with COVID is important. But I'd say the bigger deal is it may be kind of the first step toward true virtual care. So a move away from seeing care as being a transactional thing that happens in the context of a visit to a clinician, or a trip to the ER, or a trip into the hospital, and rather sees healthcare as a much more continuous process of monitoring and measuring and having your questions answered and using tools in real time at home or at work. And why might telemedicine pave the way? Well, first of all, some part of that virtual care is going to be telemedicine, is going to be you need to talk to an expert, might be a doctor, might be a nurse, might be someone else. And telemedicine makes that easier and better. So that's part of it. But part of it is, if I used to see you in my office every 3 months, one time, That would be the time I would check your blood pressure, check your weight, check your glucose, check your oxygen level. But if I'm no longer seeing you in the office, if we're having virtual visits, now I'm dependent on you checking your blood pressure with your digital blood pressure cuff and you checking your weight with your digital scale. And my guess is you're not just doing that once every 3 months. You're probably checking your weight every day and checking your blood pressure maybe once, twice a day, checking your sugar if you have diabetes 4 times a day. You're doing it with a digital tool. So why not stream all of that data? It's a much richer data stream. It's much more informative than just checking this thing once. So the data that we're going to get is more semi-continuous and less episodic. So this will be a huge question for professionalism and for professional identity, professional organization, almost everything about the world of clinical practice, which is how do we manage these new data flows? So let me show you a little bit about what that might look like. Here's the fantasy world. Patients have digital tools at home, maybe on their wrist, maybe the digital scale, the digital glucometer. Eventually your toilet will be wired, so it'll measure, whether your urine looks okay every time you go to the bathroom. And all of that data are streaming. And every now and then I hear a talk like this, and some utopian who doesn't actually understand clinical practice will say, how wonderful is it going to be? Because all of that data is going to stream right to the primary care doctor, who's going to be thrilled to see it. And the primary care doctor is going to be so happy being able to see this rich data on each of his or her 1,600 patients. Now, I will tell you, when I hear that, I have an anaphylactic reaction, because that is not a world that I am familiar with. The world I'm familiar with, I have 300 primary care docs that work for me in my department of medicine. And if I told them that we're turning that switch on today, and all of your patients are going to have their digital data streaming to you, and you'll have the responsibility to check it, be on top of it, and if you miss something, you might get sued, if something bad happens, every single one of them will quit by 5 o'clock this afternoon. So that cannot work. And yet people talk about this sort of new world of virtual care. Now, there's one piece of it, which is patients sort of getting data and managing themselves. You're on Noom and you're doing your own weight loss, or you're on Fitbit and you're monitoring your steps. That's all fine and self-contained. But in the real world of healthcare, I still think there will be healthcare systems and clinicians, and somehow we have to connect the dots between those data being collected in real time at home and some clinical system that handles it and manages it without creating chaos. Now, what might that system look like? I and others have called these people care traffic controllers. It's a basically new middle layer of the healthcare system that takes in all of this data that's streaming in and makes sense of it through some combination of artificial intelligence and real people looking at things, and then reacts to it. And let me just give you 3 use cases. Here's one patient, 112 sugars high. The algorithm bumped the insulin, but let's get the coach involved. So you see here an AI-based algorithm dealing with this immense amount of data and making choices about triage, and then saying, all right, this requires more than just a text message to the patient, and let's get a person involved, but the person's not a doctor. The system is going to figure out who is the right person at the right time, probably at the lowest cost to yield the best outcome. Here we have patient 42 has an irregular heart rate and a shorter breath. Let's do a televisit as soon as possible. And finally, in the world of the Internet of Things, where everything in your home is wired, patient 13's weight is up and oxygen saturation is worse. I'll lock the salt shaker and the refrigerator. That's going to take a little time to happen, but you get the idea that if we turn on the switch for virtual care and do not remake the healthcare system and create this new middle layer to manage this data and triage it, the healthcare system will break very quickly. And we talk about burnout today among clinicians. We have not seen anything. Now, we have seen something, and I see it every day in my health care system. We just finished a satisfaction survey of our clinicians, their Net Promoter Score, and it's gone down. And when you ask them why, reasons 1 through 10 are their email or their EMR, their electronic health record inbox. And they are not just whining. This is data from my system showing the number of inbox messages that come through the electronic health record. We use Epic, and it shows that it has gone from 400,000 to 500,000 in 2016 to 2 million today, a 4 or 5-fold increase in 5 years. And we have a slightly higher number of patients than we did back then, but nowhere near this volume. So when I wrote a book about the digital transformation of medicine, I was mostly talking about the electronic health record. And part of it was seeing how incredibly unhappy clinicians were with their electronic health records. Part of that is we turn these digital capacities on and really don't give a moment's thought to what they do to the work and to the people. And so we had, I watched clinicians unhappy because they felt they were spending all of their time typing into computers and spending no time looking patients in the eye. This is yet another manifestation of turning on this digital capacity, in this case, the patient portal, encouraging patients to use it, patients saying, great, of course, I want to ask this question of my doctor, or I need to schedule an appointment, or I need to refill a medicine. And now with the advent of open notes, that patients can see their chart and they'll have questions about it. Patients see their laboratory results as soon as they're done cooking in the lab and say, what does this mean my magnesium is a little high? Now, the patients are acting perfectly rationally. And by the way, the patients right now don't pay a copay on these, whereas if they had to go and see the doctor, that had cost them $20. So patients are acting in a completely rational and predictable way. But the flow of information and the expectation that we have of our clinicians has created something that is utterly unsustainable. This cannot work with the current way we organize things. So the solutions are hard to come by because patients expect this, and patients sort of have a right to expect it. Do we charge for these? Do we give patients a limit on how many messages they can give? How much of it can we fix with technology and artificial intelligence that answers their most common questions? How much of this is by other clinicians or other providers helping out and taking some of this burden off the hands of the physician? Hard to know. And every place is grappling with this. I can tell you it's now it's almost at the top of our agenda of things we have to work on. So, but an example of how digital transformation sounds good on a PowerPoint slide, but when you turn it on and sort of bake it into the workflow of real live people, you can end up with something that simply is not doable. And again, this is just messages. We have not really turned on to any significant degree this idea of virtual care where all sorts of new data about your heart rate and your blood pressure and your weight are flowing in seamlessly into the system. Okay, so that's sort of telemedicine / virtual care. Let me tell you about one other thing that I think this is a happy story from COVID that hit its tipping point. And this is dashboards, decidedly unsexy. But I think that COVID for the first time showed us what you can do with all of this digital data. Now, part of the reason that clinicians are so unhappy with their electronic health records is you think if you had a baby and you spent all of the time changing the baby and the baby never smiled at you. It'd be like, after a while, like, why did I have this thing? And I think that's the world of electronic health records. Clinicians feel like they're spending all this time feeding this beast, entering information. They get so little useful intelligence out of it that it makes them unhappy. But COVID made that intolerable and made clear that we need up to the minute, up-to-date information presented in ways that are usable and attractive and actionable, whether you're a frontline clinician or a manager, or what I've seen in COVID, or you're a layperson who just wanted to understand what was going on in this during this cataclysm. So I think that has been a happy acceleration and one that's really quite important. And so here are certain manifestations of this. This is My Health System's COVID-19 Enterprise Dashboard. I pulled this off last night. So this is updated minute by minute. And it shows me in the middle that we've got 15 COVID patients in the hospital, about a 700-bed hospital. Five are on ventilators. The curve of COVID cases in the hospital is there in the upper right, broken down by those in the hospital, on the ICU, and on ventilators. In the lower left, I can see our test positivity rate broken down by overall positivity of all of our tests, which is 0.9%. But importantly, 2.1% of the patients had COVID symptoms. They came in with a cough or a fever. By the way, every single one of them is sure they have COVID, but you see that only 1 out of 50 do. But interestingly, and a number I use a lot, is the asymptomatic test positivity rate. This is the someone who got a COVID test because they were about to have a cardiac operation. No symptoms at all. So about 1 out of 200 of them are positive. So I use that as my shorthand to figure out whether the person standing near me at Whole Foods in San Francisco has COVID. About 1 out of 200 people that feel fine still would test positive. So useful, I think beautifully laid out, nicely visualized, taking advantage of all this digital data that's sloshing through our tubes to give us useful intelligence, something that we've not gotten so far. Now, I'm a big fan of using data to transform the way you do your business. I learned a fair amount about this from an industry that's not healthcare, that's 10 years ahead of us in terms of collecting data on everything and spending the resources to process it and provide useful intelligence to the business to transform the way they organize themselves. That industry is Major League Baseball. And I learned it from my older son who works for the Atlanta Braves. Go Braves if you're following the World Series. And he can tell you that this hitter cannot hit a lone outside curveball above 92 miles an hour on Tuesday nights when the wind is out of the southwest and the pitcher is over 6'2". And that would take him about 3 seconds to figure out. And he asked me, like, Dad, what can you do? And I say, well, we have these sepsis alerts and they're wrong a third of the time. And that's our big victory in terms of using data that we have massive amounts to change the way we think about our care. So the development of a set of competencies around taking all this data that we are painfully collecting and using it to understand what's going on and influence what's going on and provide information and intelligence and insights to clinicians, to leaders, and to patients is definitely we have to transform ourselves. But I think COVID has moved that along because we've now seen stuff like this and we say, oh, that's great. Why don't we have that for patients with chest pain? Or patients with sepsis, or patients with treating their blood pressure, or preventing breast cancer. It's all relevant. We have massive amounts of data. We've not yet created the systems and the competencies to use it effectively. Here's just another example. It takes 5 seconds to go online and look at the case trends in any country in the world. I like this one. This is called microcovid.org. It was developed by 4 software people who lived together in a house in San Francisco, not healthcare people at all, but they said, there's nothing out there that's answering the question I have, which is how risky is it to go to the grocery store? And they said, well, can we develop a tool that allows you to do this? So they, for free, sat down one day and said, all right, what would the tool need to have? It needs to know where you are. All right, you're in San Francisco. It then knows what the case rate and the test positivity rate is. So it's going to adjust for the level of COVID in your community. It's going to ask you, what are you thinking about doing? Going to a grocery store, flying cross country, you name it. It's going to ask you whether you've been vaccinated with which vaccine. I think they probably added a booster thing by now. How many people are going to come close to you? How far away are you? How long is it going to take? And if you go on the bottom of the screen, it asks you whether you're wearing a mask and what kind. Are they wearing a mask and what kind? And then you press a little button and it says the risk of this activity is 5 micro-COVIDs. A micro-COVID is a 1 in a million chance of getting COVID. So you're taking a 1 in 200,000 chance that you'll get COVID from that 60-minute trip to the grocery store. You decide whether that's worth it. So really a nice example of sort of do-it-yourself development and a really useful tool that answers a real question that real people have in terms of living their life or doing their job. A couple other things that I want to talk about. Talk 1 second about AI. Tons of companies. They're all hyped up the yin yang. I advise a few of them. That said, I might have anticipated pre-COVID that this would be a time that AI would hit its tipping point, but I actually can't identify a truly game-changing AI application. I do think that AI was on a path toward being an important part of transformation in healthcare. If you think about what we do for a living, we're collecting data, trying to make sense of it, and there's no reason that AI can't insert itself in that process and help us do it better and cheaper, as has happened in every other industry. But I don't think we've reached the tipping point yet. I do think that COVID will accelerate that, just as it accelerated everything else. Another thing that I would have hoped would move along, didn't quite, but I do think also has been accelerated. And these are all things that sort of will determine our digital future. This one is what's called interoperability, which is how well do all of the computers and the data streams sort of sync up with each other. The classic example of interoperability is I can take my Bank of America card and stick it in a Citibank machine anywhere in the world, and it knows who I am and spits out $100. And so all the systems are connected and sort of can read each other's data. The example I sometimes use is that of the Transcontinental Railroad. These two railroads being built independently ultimately had to connect, I think in Utah. And so when I thought about interoperability 5 years ago, I was really thinking about how come my Epic system doesn't connect to this other hospital Cerner system. I think that's still a big deal and still doesn't work very well. But the bigger deal, and this is sort of a segue to this post-electronic health record era, is going to be all kinds of other digital tools that patients and clinicians are going to use. And whether it's the fancy watch or the Alexa or the smartphone or your genomics testing, all of that digital information, how does that connect to each other? And then ultimately, how well does it connect to the enterprise system, Epic, Cerner, you name it? And none of this happens now very well. It all takes a lot of money. It all takes a lot of friction. But I think it's going to move along now faster as people have recognized the importance of digital transformation. So let me switch to the last part of the digital talk, then I'll spend a few minutes on professionalism. And this is really the notion of leaving what I think is the first stage of digital transformation, which is the electronic health record era. And let me just put a finer point on that. In 2007, in the United States, fewer than 1 in 10 hospitals had an electronic health record. By 2017, a decade later, fewer than 1 in 10 did not. And the same was true of doctors' offices. So we went in a decade from being a paper-based industry to being a digital-based industry, a very big deal. Now, the leader of that effort at my place is the gentleman in the middle here. His name is Russ Cucina. He's a trained clinician informaticist. I hired him about 15 years ago. I said, you're going to have this really interesting job. We're about to implement this big electronic health record. It's going to change everything. I'm guessing it's going to take 3 to 5 years to get it to settle down and do version 2.0 and 3.0. And then I remember distinctly saying to him, but what are you going to do after we're done with that? I thought, I wondered if he still have a job. That was among the stupidest things I've ever said to someone I mentored in my career. Believe me, he is gainfully employed today because the electronic health record is getting bigger and more complicated. As we partner with community hospitals, we're putting our electronic health record in. He had to develop all the telemedicine capabilities. But importantly, there's a lot of stuff happening in digital that's now outside the EHR. And I think that is the moment that we find ourselves in. Now, part of that is the world of venture capital has discovered healthcare, discovered digital healthcare, and was waiting for the electronic health record to be put in, not because they're developing an electronic health record, because most of them have recognized that's not really the right play. They've recognized that now that the data are digital, now is the time that data can be taken and used in all sorts of ways to hopefully improve healthcare value, to improve quality or safety or access or convenience or lower costs. So the Silicon Valley world that lives around me has clearly seen this as the moment that healthcare is ready for their unique skill set, a huge amount of investments in startups. But on top of that, you have the digital giants, the 5 or 6 companies you're very familiar with, entering healthcare, seeing this as their time to transform healthcare the way they've transformed retail, transportation, everything else. So first one was Watson. After they beat the IBM beat the Jeopardy champion, they said, we're going to become Dr. Watson and take over healthcare. Google made a huge investment hiring David Feinberg from Geisinger to run their Google Health enterprise. Microsoft, big investment. Apple, particularly with hardware, their Apple Watch and the iPhone. And then probably the most exciting one was a company called Haven, which was Amazon, JP Morgan, and Berkshire Hathaway coming together saying, we're going to transform healthcare, unlimited amount of money to invest, hired Atul Gawande, the famous Harvard surgeon and author, to take over. So all very exciting. Now, just to show you how hard this is, Haven closed shop after about 3 years. Watson's for sale if any of you have some extra money. David Feinberg just left Google to take over Cerner, the electronic health record company. Apple was said to be struggling. Microsoft's still doing okay. So what's going on here? I think that what's happening is healthcare IT is entering a bumpy but very real post-electronic health record phase where the electronic health record is now at the core and the foundation, but these companies, whether they're startups or digital giants are seeing opportunities to remake healthcare. So if you think about who won the battle to be your electronic health record, it was the companies called like Cerner and Epic who were built to build an electronic health record, which was mostly about collecting data, sort of a big electronic filing cabinet, and moving it around in pretty simple ways. But if you think about what we need our digital tools to do today, consumer facing, so much of the business really is around the patient portal, beautiful user interfaces, data visualization of the kind I've shown you, learning from our data, communication tools. The electronic health records had no competencies in any of these areas. They're trying to build them, but it's not easy for them. The new era is one where all of those competencies, that's what people are asking for. Health systems are, patients are, clinicians are. And so the pressure to improve quality and lower cost, we're seeing labor shortages, and I think we're seeing healthcare systems recognize that if the solution to every problem is hiring more human bodies, it's not going to work. Digital companies are getting smarter and maturing, although the at least partial failure of the digital giants is showing that they still don't quite get how hard this is. But I think ultimately we're all realizing the limitations of what our electronic health records can offer us, and that we need more from digital. So it's what's fueling this. The other thing that I think is interesting that's happening is I think healthcare organizations are beginning to remake themselves to thrive in this new post-electronic health record era. And just to show you what it looks like at my place, we have our traditional digital arm. That's the one that Russ Cucina, who I showed you before, runs. Its job is to solve core clinical and business problems, and it's focused on the electronic health record and related tools. So it's their job is to take the electronic health record and build it out to solve core problems. We've had to develop a whole different arm of our digital enterprise that we call the Center for Digital Health Innovation. And I think of it as a solution shop. Its job is we give them big, hairy problems that don't have simple solutions. We think they're going to take 3 to 5 years for them to solve. And we're going to say, make this thing work better. And we don't know whether the solution will be something that Epic ultimately can do, or a startup does, or Google does, or we have to build it ourselves. It's probably a little bit of all that. You're probably going to have to weave all that together. And ultimately, it's going to have to integrate with the EHR, because if either doctors or patients have to go sign into a separate site, that's not going to work. So this is sort of the new work, and we've discovered that we've got to reorganize ourselves. Because if you ask the Epic people to do that kind of creative long-term problem solving, they just can't do it. They're too busy with keeping the electronic health record up and running and not getting hacked. So here's the big program they're working on now. We call it the Digital Patient Experience. And you see the mantra there, the right patient, provider, time, and modality. So it's basically everything about how we interact with patients, how we communicate with them, how we send them a bill, how we communicate with them after they had their hip replaced. How this digital data that they're collecting at home, how it gets to us and what we do with it. Complicated. It's going to take 3 to 5 years to work out. They had to really deeply understand the world of our liver transplant program versus our primary care program, which are very different, all of that. So I think healthcare systems are going to have to reorganize themselves around this work. So let me sort of end with some predictions about digital and then a couple of comments about professionalism. I think there are some easy predictions and a hard one. Easy. Health IT will transform and disrupt health and healthcare, and COVID has shortened the timeline for this by several years. I think this is easy. The new system will be less institution-focused, less geographically determined, more patient-centric, and ultimately deliver on the promise of higher quality, less expensive, and more equitable and more accessible and more satisfying care. I'd say one other thing I'm sure of, it'll be bumpy, and the winners will be any one of these 4 parties, and probably some from every category, some existing healthcare organizations that thoughtfully figure this out. I'm hoping mine is one. The big EHR vendors, don't think Epic or Cerner are going out of business, but they're going to have to innovate and open their architecture. The digital giants that are able to maintain a focus on health, and I said lower probability because I would have given them an equal chance as all the other parties 3 years ago, but seeing the struggles that Google and Apple and IBM have gone through makes me realize that even though those companies have said, and I talked to all of them, we get it, we know how hard it is, we understand we're in it for the long haul, if it's really hard and they're not making money quickly, there are just easier ways for them to make money. So I'm just not confident that they will have sticking power, although they will say that they're in it for the long haul. And then a lot of new companies and startups that skillfully address important problems, although most of them, of course, will go out of business, but that will be where a lot of the solutions come from. I think those are easy predictions. The hard thing to predict is when all this will happen. I don't know whether this is 2, 3, 10 years away. I don't think it's more than 10, and I don't think it's less than 2. So somewhere in that, but again, it's been accelerated through COVID. All right, a couple of comments about the professionalism, and at least my view as sort of an amateur follower of your field, what some of the implications of this are. And I know you'll be talking about all these things during the day. I think the training and socialization of physicians and other clinicians as credentialed experts who are the sources of all knowledge and to whom patients come for care will continue to be challenged. It's already challenged if you think about the world of Marcus Welby and the world of today and patients accessing information, some of which, of course, is wrong on the internet. The questioning of expertise, which is a general trend in our society. The expert on Facebook knows just as much as Tony Fauci, of course, which is ridiculous. That all those trends are there, but I think they are going to accelerate. I think we're also going to see that we're going to need to work more on care teams, many of them organized virtually. Just think about the care team that surrounds the care traffic controllers. And this patient really should be seen by a health coach. This patient should be seen by a physical therapist. This patient needs to be seen by a doctor, but it's all being triaged virtually. And probably all those people aren't working in the same physical space. So trying to figure out it was hard enough to figure out how you develop a care team in an office primary care practice or in a hospital ICU. Now we're going to be thinking about organizing care teams and collaborative teams where the work is fragmented across many different people, but across different spaces where it's all, the connective tissue is virtual. So even trickier. We're going to need to learn to manage data from different sources that comes at us in very different ways. So think about sort of the role of professionalism in terms of sort of what do people have to know and do and be comfortable with. Dealing with this kind of data is going to be a core skill. I think we're going to need to defend the humanistic portion of the clinician-patient encounter as value added, if in fact they are, lest they be chiseled away over time. As patients get more and more of their care virtually, as more and more of their care are fueled by data that are being collected from them virtually, and they're all getting processed by big computer systems and artificial intelligence, the question will inevitably come up, do they really need to see a doctor or an NP or a human being? How important really is a physical exam? These are sort of time-honored questions. They come up when you decided whether you needed to still see your accountant or use TurboTax, still see your bank teller or use an ATM, still walk into the bookstore or get your book from Amazon. And so there's a lot of romance and history around the clinician-patient encounter. But we're going to need to defend why it still is important and why doing it in person is important, if in fact it is. And so that's going to take research. It's going to take some hard thinking, and just saying, well, it's important because I'm really good at what I do and patients need to see me is not going to be a winning strategy. Patients will increasingly insist on this mantra that's been popularized by the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, nothing about me without me, because digital democratizes everything. And patients will increasingly have powerful tools to collect the data, find answers, and treat themselves. And clinicians and systems and providers are going to need to adapt to this. It's sort of inevitable that as there's more self tools that patients can use, fueled by digital data, and coming out of their Alexa or coming out of their watch or whatever. We're going to have to figure out sort of a new role in that ecosystem. That's very different than the world where they had to come to us to access the entire world of healthcare and get information. Sort of a few other implications that I think are real. Clinicians will also have more powerful tool, predictions, recommendations, what I call flight path monitoring. This patient is not acting the way one would have expected based on the last 10,000 patients, to guide their thinking and action. It will be easy and even natural to turn off our brains as we become more and more dependent on these tools. You end up with the driverless car problem, where inevitably you're going to see some accidents because people were told, even the car is driving itself, you still need to remain vigilant. Well, yeah, sure, but I want to check my text messages. And the next thing you know, you're driving into the side of a truck. So it's natural for people to begin withdrawing and save their brain for other things. I mean, I can tell you how natural it is. I barely remember my wife's cell phone number because I know it's in my phone. So if I ever lost my phone, I'm not sure I'd ever see her again. And I'm acting normally. I've only so many neurons. And if I can trust the technology, it's quite natural to turn it off. So part of the training and socialization and professionalism of healthcare people is going to be, how do you remain engaged when the technology is increasingly helping you out? If the X-ray is being read by the computer, but the radiologist has to do the final read and sign it and bless it, how do you be sure that that's a real read as opposed to, the computer's right all the time, I'll do this in a pro forma way? We have to be attuned to the fact that some recommendations that are driven by computer systems will be ethically problematic. We're seeing more and more of that issue of ethical bias built into AI systems. AI systems are just really good mimics. So if the AI system is using data that says that Black patients get less pain medication when they come in with a fracture, the AI system will assume that that's correct. That's the right way to treat them, as opposed to that's a manifestation of bias. It's also going to be, as more and more recommendations come from computer systems, and it's saying to us, for this patient, the right treatment for their infection is drug X. There are going to be embedded assumptions in there. Maybe drug X doesn't work as well as drug Y, but it's a lot cheaper to the healthcare system. And so as clinicians, we may have no idea of what the ethical values and the biases that were underlying those recommendations. And we're going to have to work to pay attention to that and actively monitor these issues, and at times resist them. And so I think the world of the next 10, 15 years in terms of professionalism is partly going to be a matter of balancing appropriate advocacy for some of our core values without being unduly grumpy about all this new technology and how it's different and this is not what I signed up for, or reflexive defense of the status quo. And but we will defend the status quo because we're human and we organize ourselves into guilds. And we're probably better at it than many other industries. So as I tell people who wonder about whether healthcare is going to get transformed like Uber was, I say, physicians are much, much better lobbyists than taxi cab drivers. We can say that if you do this, you're going to be putting your life at risk in a way that other industries have a harder time doing. So you're going to see a lot of back and forth, a lot of politics, a lot of advocacy. And I think it's going to be important to really try hard to get this right and not just fight for the status quo because the status quo, because much of this transformation, I think, is actually going to be good for patients and ultimately will be good for clinicians if we get it right. So again, with that as a theme, this is Mel Chetlin, who's a very senior, highly respected clinical cardiologist at UCSF, and really a member of, Mel's probably 80 now, of sort of the older generation who came into medicine with a set of assumptions about what being a doctor was and the sort of primacy and of the physician, and physicians being on pedestals and patients coming to them as fonts of expertise and recommendations. There was a meeting I was at a few years ago where we were talking about transformation. We were talking about digital transformation, the new regulatory environment, sort of quality measurement, transparency, patient, physician report cards online, all that stuff. And I could see most of the senior clinicians in my department getting more and more depressed. And I would have thought Mel would be part of that group. He was certainly from that era. And he got up at the end of the meeting, grabbed the microphone, and he said something that just shocked me. It was exactly the opposite of what I expected. He said, this could be worse. And I said, wow, that's kind of surprising. And then he went on and he said, I could be younger. And I thought that was amusing. And I tell it to you because A, it was amusing, but B, I actually think he's wrong. I actually think that at the end of the path here, we will have a world where we're able to deliver better and safer and cheaper and more accessible care to patients. And if we get this right, the jobs of clinicians will be better because a lot of the work that we currently do adds very little value, is well below, quote, our license. And one can envision a world where when someone comes to see a doctor or a nurse, they're doing the stuff that they're uniquely trained to do. And it allows them to really be at their highest level of professionalism, which is they're doing the things that they're uniquely qualified to do. And part of that is empathy. Part of that is listening. Part of that is bringing it all together for patients. So I think I can see a way that this ultimately enhances the work of clinicians and enhances professionalism. But we shouldn't estimate the challenges along the way. And I hope this has been helpful in laying some of them out to you. So let me stop there and stop sharing, and look forward to chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you very, very much, Dr. Wachter. And this was a very inspiring talk, and surely gave us all lots of food for thought. We have about 12 minutes for further discussion. So please, anybody raise your hand and open your microphone and ask any questions or comments you may have.
Actually, we've actually met at Baylor College of Medicine before. Nice. I'm interested in a few times you've said that we have to show that empathy and humanism is value added, if indeed it is. And I don't know whether that was your phrase to invoke interest in studying its value, or if you're not sure it does have value. I'd like you to clarify how you feel about that. And if you think it needs to be studied and hasn't been adequately studied, how would you go about documenting the dollar and cents value of that type of that part of care?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, I was quite intentional about saying that I think it needs to be studied and ultimately defended, in part because I think that those of us who are healthcare professionals have a bias that, of course it is. Of course people want to see me. I think that that's probably what bank tellers used to say and what accountants used to say and travel agents used to say. And it turned out that, and I don't want to trivialize this. Obviously, telling someone they have cancer is very different than planning their trip to Aruba. So I don't want to take the analogy too far. But I think it is that healthcare is very expensive. The time of healthcare professionals is very expensive. I do think that as people have the ability to get answers to their questions, independent of going to see and take the time of credentialed experts, they will be inclined to do it unless we can demonstrate that there's real value in those encounters. Now, my bias is there is, because otherwise I get very sad about my last 40 years of work. And I can certainly point to circumstances where, telling someone they have cancer, the idea that you would learn that from your computer is sort of, so upsetting. But that's not what I do most of the time. Most of the time I'm telling people they have high blood pressure and helping them try to figure out how to manage that, or 100 other things that I actually think could potentially be done well by effective digital systems and sort of, smarter digital agents. So, I could see a world where you get a certain kind of healthcare that is largely impersonal and driven by the technology for your basic insurance cost. And if you want that 20-minute visit with the doctor or an hour visit with the doctor, you'll pay extra for it. How do I know that? Because look at concierge care. Look at what people are willing to pay to have an hour with the doctor and not 15 minutes. There's a price that people put on that. And how does that happen? It happens by the physician limiting the size of his or her practice so that they have that time. So I think it's going to be important for us just to not assume that people are willing to pay that price, and not to assume that it adds so much value that it's sort of a no-brainer. And to demonstrate where it has value, but also importantly, demonstrate where it actually doesn't, where patients can get what they need from a system through intelligent digital devices, and come into that as sort of an open two-tailed question that could have the answer we want and may have the answer we don't want. And how to study it, I don't know. I mean, do you randomize people to to seeing a person versus seeing a machine? Probably. We're going to have to see those sort of experiments and see what happens.
So clearly there's a lot of work ahead of us. Alice, you also had a question, and there are quite a few in the chat too.
Yeah, thank you for recognizing me. Thank you for this talk. And I'm wondering, as an educator, my world has been transformed actually in light of COVID-19 and how we're doing education. And I'm wondering your thoughts as a visionary on thinking, is this going to stay this way with our residents? And, everything's going to be done on Zoom or Teams or whatever system you use. And there will be no reason to come back together in the classrooms, because that's basically where we're at.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the visionary comment. I don't think so, but I'll try. I think education is a good analogy, and the world of academic medicine is a very interesting hybrid, sort of unprecedented hybrid of educational enterprises and clinical enterprises. So, right. And you think about the two fields in life that have been sort of relatively immune to digital transformation, they're education and healthcare. And now is our time, and both happening at the same time is pretty interesting. I sort of think about education in some ways the same way as I think about healthcare delivery. What we've seen, because we were forced to see this in the last 18 months, is sort of what it looks like to do a lot of virtual stuff for education. And I think for many of us, we've seen the value of that. There are things that you can do that you could not do in person. I host grand rounds at UCSF every week, and in the old days, we've got 40 people coming there for a sandwich and to hear a talk. And now we often get 1,000 people, and I put it on YouTube, and we get 100,000 people when we do a COVID topic. And it's been incredibly gratifying. And for a world-class expert, for that person to have to schlep to San Francisco to give an hour talk is stupid. Why not have them come and speak? So I do that every week. It's opened up massive degrees of freedom. On the other hand, just sort of like the workplace in general, where you have to figure out what was the value of that in-person, coffee machine, water cooler conversation. And I think those are the huge questions. I'm approaching our educational enterprise the way I'm approaching our clinical enterprise. We've now seen some things we never would have done on our own because they would have represented too much change. We've now done them. We've seen the value. Let's go into the coming era in some ways almost agnostic, starting with a blank piece of paper. If you were going to organize this thing for the best educational outcomes at the lowest cost and the lowest friction, how would you do it? What is the mix of virtual and in person? And I think, like most complicated things in life, the answer is going to be somewhere in between, much more virtual than we were before, but not completely virtual. And I think those are analog questions to what we're asking about work in general. Does everybody work from home all the time? Well, no, there's some value to rubbing shoulders. What is the value? How do we quantify it? It's much cheaper if everybody works from home. People are happier. We don't have to build a new office building, but we've lost these really important interactions that are more informal. So also recognize the digital tools will get better. So, these sort of informal interactions, we say, well, you got to be in person to have those. Really? Maybe with today's tools, maybe with future tools, they'll be better at replicating sort of that informal water cooler interaction. So, yeah, long answer to, I don't think we know. We have to really see the last 2 years as an amazing opportunity to open up the box and think hard about what is the right way to organize things without a lot of preconceptions based on, well, we can't do that because it's not the way we've ever done it. And really true in both education and clinical work. I think they're quite parallel to one another.
Thank you very much.
So there are several questions in the text, in the chat, about the digital divide, about lower resourced healthcare systems in the US, but also around the world. There are some major differences. Yeah. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the digital divide, I was on my high school debating team, and sometimes they would say you can take this side of the argument or that side of the argument. And on this one, I'm equally comfortable with both sides. You could easily see how the digital divide would get worse. The tools are hard to use. They're expensive. You don't have good internet. And now that's the way we deliver healthcare. You're kind of screwed because you don't have it. On the other hand, the tools are not that expensive. I think companies are now thinking more and more about usability and making sure it's language appropriate and education level appropriate. A lot of the digital divide is inherent in the existing system. There's no hospital or doctor in your area or neighborhood, and now all of a sudden you can access clinical care because you can get it virtually in ways that you couldn't before. So I think one of the nice things is that the digital transformation in healthcare is happening in an era where we're thinking about equity, 100 times more than we thought about it 5 years ago. And so I think I have an article in JAMA this week about this, that I think it increases the probability that we will get this righter than we would have otherwise. Because I think if we were doing this 10 years ago, we wouldn't have given the digital divide a lot of thought. We wouldn't have given measures of equity a lot of thought, incentives for equity a lot of thought. I think today it's inconceivable that we won't do that because it's front and center of everybody's radar screen. It's going to get measured. There will be accountability on it. And, if you're a healthcare system or you're a payer, the cost of making sure that at least the things that cost money aren't the source of the divide. To spend $1,000 to make sure a patient has access to telemedicine, if we can prove that that would prevent an ER visit, you've paid for it 5 times over, by doing that there. So the question is, can you move money around easily, and will entities spend that money? But I think at the end of the day, this will shrink it will improve equity. It will improve access rather than harm it at a sort of a net level, although there certainly will be cases where it will compromise, and we've got to be very careful and thoughtful about that.
Yeah, thank you very much. There are a few other questions in the chat, and we have 2 minutes left. So maybe one of you could share it quickly by unmuting yourself. Tom, for example, he's the president of APHC. You had several questions. Would you like to share one of them?
Hi, Elizabeth, thanks. And thank you, Dr. Wachter. Fantastic, fantastic talk. Thank you very much. Not so much a question, but I was actually addressing a point that was made from an earlier question about the impact on rural care environments. So I sit sort of at the bottom doorstep of Mayo Clinic in Rochester over here in La Crosse, Wisconsin, where is a mid-sized health system that serves a large rural population, where the system itself, I think, where I am at, is set up and capable of managing this digital transformation of care. Where I think some of the worry and concern is, are our patients going to be able to keep up? Mm-hmm. Right? And what impact will that have on their access and ability? Now, this is something I'll be talking about over the next few minutes in my talk. But I think that's at least a concern that I've seen. So certainly there's huge promise here, but perhaps you could comment just briefly on what you see as the impact in these smaller market areas. Yeah, no, it's a great question. Amazon can deliver everything that I need when I want to buy a thing. Mayo cannot deliver your baby virtually yet, do your surgery virtually yet, stitch up your kid's wound yet. And I say yet quite purposefully. Who knows what life looks like 10 years from now, 15 years from now. But your small hospital system is going to struggle, as they all are, because they're going to need these digital capabilities including some level of resistance to hacking and ransomware, to survive. And the ability of a small system to have the scale to develop these systems it's very hard. So I think this is one of the things that's pushing more regionalization, more networks, as smaller hospitals just find it harder and harder to have the scale that they need to do all this. But I do think you are going to see the emergence of bigger regional or bigger national brands. Your cancer care, do you go to the local folks, or is MD Anderson or Sloan Kettering or Dana-Farber, do they have sort of a digital virtual outpost in your region that maybe is partnering with your local enterprise? You go in to there to get your chemo, but your diagnosis and some of the basics of your management are done by these national brands. I don't think we know, but I do think that if you study other industries, the directionality here is all scale. It's sort of, if you think healthcare is following the path of every other industry, only 10 or 15 years behind, and there's some unique differences between healthcare and other industries, in part the need for in-person presence for some of the things we do, you would say
you're going to see more consolidation, more national brands that emerge who have unique competencies, have the scale to build out these systems, and have the brand name that people say, oh, I can get care from, Johns Hopkins or UCSF in my neighborhood without having to drive or fly to this fancy place. I'm going to do that. So yeah, I think that is the direction. I don't think it's not going to be tomorrow that a mid-sized small community hospital is threatened by this, but I'd say in the next few years, they better have this on their radar screen as they think through their strategies and their partnerships.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Wachter, for joining us. And this was really a very inspiring start of the conference.
Great. Thank you.
We are unfortunately out of the time, but if you have a moment to address some of the issues that were brought up, some of the discussions that were brought up in the chat, that would be great. If not, we can also send you those comments to you later on.
I have a couple of minutes. I'll respond to a few of them if I can. Thanks.
Thank you. That would be wonderful.